But I think it's a fantastic time to be talking about some of these issues. As Eva said, it's very, very topical. And we're facing big challenges. We all know that. The economic crisis, environmental degradation, social fragmentation, and other issues which we need to face up to. And the cities are the places where these, a lot of these issues are thought about, dealt with, not dealt with as well. I've just been asked to, and I think that while that's important for planning, me as a planner, I think about this all the time because I'm thinking 5, 10, 20 years ahead in each of the places that I work, is that planning has to rethink the way it works. Traditionally, we've had a kind of predict and provide approach. We said, oh, the population will go up by 2% a year, this many children will be born, this many schools will need to be built, etc. But we're operating in a very different world now. And to be honest, that old predict and provide centralised approach to planning didn't really work anyway. I quite like this image here. I feel like the planning system's been punched in the mouth. Mike Tyson had it right there. So we need to rethink our approach. In terms of the 3 days, most of the people here will be working with me for 3 days, which is great. Today we'll be talking about the Green City. Really looking at the challenges that cities face, some of the responses to those challenges, and then some particular sort of green city projects that will lead us quite nicely into some presentations which some of you, I understand, prepared around the Madrid Rio project. Tomorrow we're discussing the political city and urban design, looking at the contested nature of how cities change and how people, different communities get involved in the process. And I'll take you through an interactive session there as well and some other experience that I've got. And then finally, on the third day, we'll be looking at the complex city, the idea of how we apply the theories of emergence and different thinking to how cities change. What I hope you'll get out of the next 12 hours are 3 things. An understanding that urban thinking, urban design, urbanisation is vitally critical to making sure that we'll have a good quality of life and the world is a positive place to live in. Secondly, that behavioural and social cultural factors are as important as environmental ones. I could, quite frankly, stand here for the next 3 days and talk to you about green technology in cities, but I won't because it's easy to find online, and actually my view is that they're only a small part of the solution. And lastly, again, this last point around the idea that we need both bottom-up and top-down complementary activity within society to make things work, and planning has been very poor at the bottom-up and attempting to do a top-down approach. What I want you to do is to work with me in the next 12 hours. I hear you're a very interactive group, which is great. I want you to help to demonstrate that you understand some of the issues that are faced by cities. You live in a city now. Most of you probably have been brought up in a village or town or city. Your experiences are valid. I want you to generate ideas, communicate them clearly and succinctly, and to bring thinking from other disciplines to bear on the issues as we raise them. This is Uruk. It's probably the first city that was formally sort of recognised in the world. It was built about 6,000 years ago in modern-day Iraq, population of about 50,000 people. And the forces which drew the city to be created, of clustering, of people trading, of defence, are very similar to the kind of growth in cities that's happening today. Rather ironically, Uruk declined because it wasn't able to adapt to climate change in the area. It wasn't able to adapt, and it built up too much debt, and it wasn't able to defend itself, which has some resonances for modern-day cities. But the other point I want to make about Uruk is it's only 6,000 years old, and human civilization is obviously a lot older. So urbanisation is a very, very recent phenomenon, in essence. 2007 is a very, very important year because of what Eva mentioned earlier on. It's the first year that the UN estimated that the human population was more than half living in cities. And the cities are growing across the world. I'm going to talk you through, it's a global phenomenon. The urban population is more than 50% in large parts of the world, as I say. And that growth has been very, very recent. So in 1800, only 3% of the world lived in cities. Took them 100 years to get to 10%, which is still relatively low, mainly in industrialised nations such as Britain and other places in Europe. But then suddenly from 1900 to around 2000, it's increased to over 53% at the moment. And that's due to continue to increase. The next 40 years, we're going to have another 50% on top of that, as it were, of people living in cities. So this is an enormous, enormous challenge, unprecedented. Yes?
I would like to know how many people have to live together to be called like a city?
There is no strict definition. There are many, many definitions of cities. It would certainly say in many tens of thousands is a normal one. But the different countries, different cultures have different understandings of cities, and sometimes you have towns which are adjacent to each other, but because they operate as a city, because in essence they're so close that they are one. So it's a complicated question, but I could hopefully give you an idea. Very, very importantly, at the moment we have 1 billion people living in informal settlements in the world. They face a huge range of different issues, from land tenure right through to flooding, poverty, etc. This is one of the biggest challenges that face us. And the numbers are simply staggering. I mean, 5 billion people will live in cities by 2030. So I'd try and argue that it's probably one of the critical questions in getting right in terms of making the place more sustainable. In terms of the growth, it is a global phenomenon, but you see these rings show where the majority of these large cities lie, and they tend to be in Asia. And in fact, 4 of the top 5 cities in the world are actually in Asia. Tokyo, 34 million, which is the biggest conurbation in the world. To give you an idea, Madrid, is, with its region, is about 6 million. So we're talking something enormous. Delhi, Shanghai, Guangzhou and Seoul, all about 25 million people or so. So these are the megacities. Having said that, though, much of the growth will actually happen in the sort of small to medium scale cities of the 250,000 to 500,000. So, and much of the response, although lots of people live in shanty towns, governments, private sector developers are throwing up lots and lots of buildings like this around the world. This is a global phenomenon. Hundreds of thousands of towers are being built. It's estimated in China alone 64 million homes a year need to be built to accommodate their urban population that's growing. And a lot of people are moving to things like this, which is kind of ironic because I generally tend to work in the UK context. And in the 60s and 70s in the UK, we spent a lot of government money and time and effort building high-rise development, sort of high-rise 60s housing. You may have seen some of, and it happened all over Europe, but we did an awful lot of it in Britain. And I spend most of my time trying to sort out those and solve some of the issues those places created. So my fear, I suppose, in seeing some of these images and being in some of these places is that we're storing up enormous problems for the future in terms of how these places actually function. Can I just ask, am I going too quickly, or is this okay? I'm aware that not everyone's a native English speaker. So this is a project I'm working on at the moment. It's a place in South East London. It's called Thamesmead. It was built as an exemplar sustainable community in the late 60s. They didn't call it a sustainable community, but that's what they meant when they talked about the things they wanted to achieve, with a mixed, balanced bunch of people, places to work, near places to live, safe and secure, green, etc. It also happens to be one of the most, it's probably the biggest problem area in the whole of London. And there's 5,000 homes there, and we're spending many, many months and years, and people have done the last years trying to sort out the problems here. We'll probably talk about this project a bit more. It's fascinating. Another thing to say is that in its time it was thought of as, as the state of the art. 10,000 people a year from around the world visited it in the early 70s to see if they could take back the learnings back to their own countries. And yet now in London we see this as one of the biggest problems that we're facing. So just because someone shows a nice shiny image doesn't always mean that it's actually a positive outcome. Cities are immense consumers of resources. Another statistic, again, 75% of the world's CO2 is produced in cities, and we'll discuss, but at the same time, only 2% of the world's surface is actually covered by cities. So these are intense agglomerations of people with enormous consequences. In fact, if you took the whole world's population and in density of Paris and put it into one city, it would take up about 3 states in the United States. That's the entire world's population in one city. If it's London, which is a lower-rise city with more suburban kind of form, it would take up about 5 states of the United States. If you took Houston, which is a very sprawling place, I don't know if you've been there, it's very car-dominated, it would take up the majority of the country. So it's not just about a number of people, it's the form, it's how they actually work and live together that's really important, and that we're going to talk about in the next 3 days. So as by means of introduction, rather than me just talking at you, because that'll be very tedious after a bit of time, I just want to go around and ask people to just tell me what village, town or city they're from and what they consider to be the single most important issue facing that city. If you were mayor of that city, you wanted to make it more sustainable, what would be your number one thing that you would try and do? I'm going to pick on someone to start, I'm afraid, but we will just quickly go around the room. Please make it less than, oh yes, there is a microphone here as well. Please make it less than 30 seconds, otherwise we'll be here a long time. But just quick introduction and say where you're from and what you think the key issue is. Sorry, sir, do you mind starting?
No, sorry.
I think it's on, that they can hear it in the... With
Okay. I'm from Seville,
Okay.
and well, the main challenge that Seville should is probably about communication. You have infrastructure for communication in terms of transportation inside the city,
Okay.
because it has a strong historical center and many problems to build metro
Okay.
underground.
So it's about getting public transit to work. Thank you.
I'm from Madrid, and I think the main challenge in Madrid would be transport and the quality of air.
Yeah.
Right now, in these days, you can see a big
Lots of smog.
Yeah, a lot of smog in the city because of the stability of the climate, which is many days of the year in Madrid.
Thank you. Can everyone hear at the back, by the way? Can you hear the people at the front? Okay.
I work for the Energy Efficiency and Renewables Agency here in Spain, IDAE. And I'm from a little town in nearby Madrid, which is 80,000 inhabitants. Its name is Guadalajara. And I think the greatest challenge for the city is not on, well, maybe it's transport, inside transport. What is the way that population moves inside the city? But apart from that, I think it's reinventing the city towards its the main businesses that the city wants to project its actions in the future. Is more interesting for them, for the city as a whole, more than the sustainability and what is the low carbon city standards.
Okay, so it's an economic question of what the city
It's an
should be.
economic question, I guess. Yeah,
Thank you.
It's more important.
Yeah.
I'm from Cartagena, which is a
Sorry, can you speak up a little bit? I can't hear you.
I'm from Cartagena, which
Yeah.
is a small city in Murcia, and I think that the most important problem in Cartagena is that everybody use the car for go everywhere
Yeah.
almost. It's a pollution problem.
Sure, thank you.
I'm from Madrid, and well, I agree with him that I think that one of the most important problems here are the transport because of the pollution, and maybe also a good way to improve it would be with kind of efficiency on the use of electricity.
Yeah, okay.
Does it work?
I think it works. It goes into the computer over there, so please project your voice. So.
I'm from Madrid, and I think the main challenge is to provide an environment in which people can work in an effective way, and in other terms, that we produce more than we consume, and at the same time, in a kind of environment which provides a nice, pleasant place to live.
Quality of life issues there. I think that's very, very good points.
I live here in Madrid, and I agree with all of them. Quality of air and pollution and public transport. are the main solutions to change. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, my name is Laura. I'm from Madrid as well, and I agree with them. I think the main problem in Madrid is pollution and the way that people think. We need to change it because nobody wants to leave the car at home and going by public transport. So this is a problem. And another thing that I think is a problem that we may be facing is that everybody spends loads of hours at work, and they don't have time to spend with family and, you know, in social time or whatever. So I think this is a problem of urbanism, because we spend a lot of time in transport, and, you know, we
Sure.
cannot.
Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Marie. I'm from Munich. And Munich is known as a very expensive city. And I think one of the challenges is to integrate people from other countries, because a lot of people would like to come or are coming there, and they are in very dense areas. And so I don't know what social issues it creates there.
So it's about integration, social cohesion. That's a very good response, thank you.
Good morning. I'm Rodrigo. I'm from Caracas, Venezuela.
Yeah.
I think the main issues in my city would be the way it was built. Since we have two cities, you have the slums and you have the whole city. So there are two cities which are not connected. You also have a problem of public transport, which doesn't integrate the city and forces people to have cars. And since we have the cheapest prices in the world for gasoline, well, traffic is really a problem and a waste of time, matter for pollution and well, many things. So basically, it's urbanization and public transport, in my point of view.
Good, and I think it's good that you make the point that they're linked together. Oh, do you want to go backwards, and then otherwise we'll...
Good morning.
Good morning.
My opinion, apart from
Sorry,
water,
where are you from?
From Madrid.
Okay.
Okay.
So.
Apart from water and energy supply, which are other problems related to urban growth, I think a very big challenge is to get a well-balanced urban structure, because we have a lot of many only residential areas far away from offices areas where people work, so that causes the transport problems.
Yes.
Here in Madrid as well.
It's a good point. So it's about creating more mixed areas so you can live and work and you can get local services in the same place. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Patricia, and I'm from São Paulo, Brazil, and following the points of Rodrigo and my peer here, I'm going to talk about urbanization and how the city has burst because it attracted jobs. Because we have a huge migration in Brazil from the rural areas into urban areas, as it has been a trend in the world since the 70s. But this caused, the city is not planned, so it was expanded in a controllable way, and that created a lot of slums. And because we compete with the industries and the commercial center in the same capital, the industries release a lot of problems in the city and creates a lot of problems by attracting these people to come here, go there, and at the same time, the government don't provide housing planning. So this is a huge struggle in São Paulo in particular.
Sounds like lots of linked issues. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Luca from Bologna, Italy, north of Italy. I think the main issues of my city is that it's an historical city, so in the center we cannot drill to have a subway, so the transportation is main issues there. And yeah, we have a lack of cycling routes, so it's not really sustainable, and we need to move just by car, and there's a lot of traffic jam there, so that's it.
Thank you.
I'm Manuel, I'm from Granada, and I think the main problem in the city, well, in my city also, is that we have to change like our mind, no? To consume and all those things. And the main problem I think is the energy we have, and of course the transport. We have to mix also the integrated renewable energies and all the things. I think the main issue.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Shafrina and I come from Malaysia. And well, I grew up in several cities, but two of which are New York and Kuala Lumpur. And the key issues that I managed to observe when I was growing up in these two cities was congestion and also pollution. In Malaysia, for example, congestion is a big problem because we have public transportation available, but people don't really use it because it's not that well connected to the parts of the city and outside of the city that the people need to go to. With regard to pollution, we experience haze, a lot of haze, but that's not only a result of the congestion or combustion of vehicles, it's also from the pollution that comes from Indonesia. When they encounter pollution in Indonesia, the air gets blown to Malaysia as well. So that's a cross-regional problem. as
Response,
well.
yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And the same for New York too.
Good morning. Good morning. My name is John. I'm from Bilbao in the north of Spain. I think there are two main problems. The first has to do with urban density and structure, and has to do, in this case, dealing with stopping suburbanization and metropolization. And the other main challenge has to do with urban renewal projects that usually they are developed in the central areas, but I think it's really important to do it also in the neighborhoods.
Thank you. Very good point.
Hi, my name is Diana from Bogota, Colombia, and I think that Bogota faces two main problems. The first one is the good quality public transportation. Bogota is a city around 8 million people, and we don't have a metro, for example, so it's incredible, and this is related with the lack of density of the city. Bogota is really extent, is really large, and for example, the new buildings or the housing. New buildings are being built around in the surroundings area because it's cheaper. So the city is getting large and large and large, and we don't have good quality public transportation or public services that could connect the city with all the people with the city. So I think it's the main two problems that the city faced.
Thank you. Just in terms of this side of the room then, so it's mainly about a mixture of a lot of issues about transport and its relationship with the way in which the city is developed, its structure, its density, the form of the city. Discussion about where we should invest, whether it's in the central area or in peripheral areas. The idea about sprawl. People are saying that there's uncontrolled development happening in certain places which is unplanned. And these are all linked issues, and I'll discuss them briefly, but there's a good bunch of summaries there. Just keep it quite quick because we're going to run out of time otherwise.
Okay. Hi, I'm Adrian from Madrid, and I have to agree with all the people from Madrid. Pollution and
pollution and transport. Thank you.
Hi, I'm from Warsaw, Poland, and well, first I want to say that's transportation, but after what Diana said, I don't think it's a bigger issue because we are a 3 million people city, and we have one line and now a second building, so we're getting there. But the main issue, I think, is that during the communist time, there wasn't any urban planning. So the city was in a big mess. And actually only now we are starting to having a central planned city to where to build high buildings, where to build like, I don't know, people districts where people live and so on and so on. So I think the urban planning is the main issue here.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name is Akuma, and I'm from Baku, Azerbaijan. And the biggest problem with Baku is that it's a pretty small city, but everyone feels like they need a car. So then you have cars parked everywhere on the sidewalks, and it makes it very unsafe for pedestrians.
Hello, I'm Tatiana. I'm also from Madrid, but I live in the outskirts. And in my city where I live, during the last years, it has happened a very fast urbanization process. And for me, the most visible consequences is that now we have much less greener areas that we were used to enjoy in the past, so part of the natural value is lost. And also you can easily see an increase of traffic jams, congestion, air pollution, which I think is just a decrease of the quality of life of the inhabitants.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Derek. I'm from Rotterdam in the Netherlands.
In our city, we have two big problems. One is the pollution. We have a big harbor, which needs to be a bit moved out of the city because the pollution from the harbor is normally blown into the city because the harbor is in the west, and the wind comes from the west in general. The other problem is that in the Second World War, almost all the center was destroyed by German airplanes. Sorry, Marie, but it happened like that. And now they are still reconstructing the city, and the city is too empty. There are not many people living there, only working. So during the nights it's desolated, and people they don't feel safe. So they have big urban challenges.
So very good points there. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Yana. I am from Lima, Peru. And I think that the big issue of Lima is that immigration from rural zones to the city. In Peru, we have 25 million people, but in Lima, they live 10. So there is a great congestion of people, and they live in the valleys of Lima. So they has invaded many zones. No, and they live in the worst condition you have ever seen, and also the traffic jam. We also don't have a metro, so it's a mess.
This is an interesting phenomenon of squatter settlements when they have to be on the periphery of the city, have even more challenge than those that are able to occupy old industrial areas in the centre of the city. But we'll come on to that as well. Thank you.
My name is Natalia. I'm from San Jose, Costa Rica, and the main issue of my city is that it lacks of a good public transportation. So this leads that everyone needs a car, and now we are a small country, so there are more cars than highways, and the urban planning it's obsolete. It's like 12 years behind. So we're facing a growth with no direction.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Laura. I'm also from Bogota. And besides from the public transportation problem, I think that our problem is also that many people from the rural areas have moved to the city.
Yeah.
And these have caused, of course, problems in housing, in unemployment, and security.
Hi, I'm Fabio from Brazil, from São Paulo. There is an endless number of issues to.
What's the number one? What's the number one?
Yeah, and but I will highlight like the traffic jams, the pollution, and the zoning issue.
Hi, my name is Carlos. I'm from Barcelona, Spain, and the two main challenges in my city, I think, that are also the pollution, but also the density in the core, in the center of the city, and also the insecurity. A little.
So that's an interesting contrast with Rotterdam, where you're saying that there's actually a different issue, that the centre has become almost overpopulated. So that's interesting, different challenges. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Antonio. I'm from Madrid, and I have to agree with most of the people from here, and I think that the biggest problem is the efficient transportation.
Hi, I'm Eriko. I'm from Hungary, and originally I'm from a little town with 15,000 people. And because of this, the biggest problem there, basically it's a nice place to live, but young people don't think so, because it doesn't offer any possibilities for young people. Not only because of job, there are some jobs, but because of living there, because of leisure time and so on, and they move to bigger cities. So it is lacking of young people.
Excellent point on economic opportunities.
I'm Francesco from Italy. I was born in the south of a small village, but I spent most of my life in Tuscany. So I will talk about Lucca. It is a small city, around 80,000 people, and it is very well known about environmental quality and historic buildings. So my point is how we will maintain this quality of life, and we will preserve historic building and integrate it with modern buildings,
yes,
with modern urban planning, to maintain the same value we can enjoy right now for the next generation. And maintain, of course, the quality of life about environmental issues, with pollution and traffic and this kind of stuff.
I think that's a really good point about cultural heritage. I mean, lots of images that we'll see from other cities is that much of that's being basically pulled apart in order to build these new cities.
Hello, my name is Rodrigo. I live in Madrid. And I think that the main challenge in Madrid is, in fact, the planning system itself. it doesn't engage the city at all. And it's a very long and tedious process that has no ability at all to adapt to changes which are in fact very, very fast in relation to the whole planning system process and how decisions are made and when they are made and who makes them.
So this is a fantastic point about a sustainable city being one where people can engage, a wide bunch of stakeholders can engage with the city in a positive way. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Blanca Martin. I'm from Madrid also. And I think one of the key urban challenges for the future is just to involve citizens, like non-expert citizens, in urbanism or to transmit them the concepts of urbanism, to make them be conscious about the impacts on environment that the urbanization has on the land consume or other consumes. And other of the challenges, I think, is to bring back the rationalization or scientific criteria to urban planning, because I think the urban planning in the last years have been driven by economic principles and not by rationalism principles. Sorry.
Thank you very much.
Hi, this is Jaime Silos from Madrid. To add one more, I say we have to face a major resource dislocation, because all around Madrid there are more than a handful of newborn suburbs with no population at all, with all the investment made with public transport and facilities. So I think this is one of them.
Those neighbourhoods that need to be more integrated into the city. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Juan Luis San Pedro. I'm CEO of Skybus. Skybus is a new form of transport, on-demand transport for cities. It allows basically people from any point to any point directly without transfers at very low cost. So this allows that people have an alternative to private car, because it's as flexible as the car and it has a cost is smaller than the car. And especially Skybus is concerned with peripheric areas where urbanism is very sparse, so that public collective transport systems do not really match the type of urbanism and do not really address connections between mobility poles in the periphery, say for example business parks and residential areas. So this is the kind of movements and mobility that Skybus basically addresses at this moment.
Thank you very much and welcome.
Lastly, I'm Tabitha Nkandawire from Malawi, that is Africa, and I live in a city called Blantyre, and I feel we have two major problems. One of it is the road network, but also waste management. We don't have the facility for waste management.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed. I'll take that back. That's great for all those inputs. And I'm going to probably cover quite a few of them in the next few slides, but hopefully put it in a broader context for you. We had some good cultural, social issues as well as environmental issues, which I was pleased about. I'm going to characterise the urban challenges of the 21st century with these 12 or 13 points. Firstly, and close to my own heart as an urban designer, is the poor quality of urban design. Now, urban design we'll talk about more tomorrow, but in essence, it's traditionally come out of an idea that you can look at a city, these are plans of different cities, and think about how the people actually move and use those spaces and buildings around them. Whether it be a traditional grid, such as New York, a more sort of organic form of development such as Rome, or sort of hybrid such as London, or any other city. It's how you think about these spaces and buildings and how people use them. But the reality of urban design in much of these rapidly urbanizing cities is actually incredibly poor. This is the suburbs of Istanbul, one of the fastest growing cities in the world, and it's traditional. It could be anywhere though, but it is essentially there. The municipal authorities built this very large road here. Very poor environment for cyclists, for pedestrians. You see this couple here struggling over what is essentially unmade land to get to. Well, we don't know where to get to. There's no bus stops. Where are the local shops? Very hard to find them. And these towers, they're just sitting in open space. And this is somewhat ironic, given that Istanbul has some of the best spaces, buildings and places in Europe, I'd argue. So it's creating these kind of problematic suburbs. Moving to Mumbai, one of the, again, rapidly growing megacities in the world. This is some of the sort of more historic areas of Mumbai, and you see how flexible these buildings and spaces are, how democratic they are. 65% of the people in Mumbai work in the informal economy. A guy can come up and set up his stand here. No one's going to move him on, or he can negotiate with his peers. These buildings, they could be housing for people, they could be offices for people. Okay, they look a bit messy, it looks dirty, it looks disorganized. On the other hand, it's a very, very adaptable piece of urban fabric, I'd argue. And in contrast, what the Mumbai authorities are allowing to happen in their city is for huge amounts of these gated developments to come up in and around the city. That's their solution to this demographic change that we're seeing. Not only are these essentially enclaves for just one type of person, but they have their own internal malls, which are privatized space. So if you're an informal trader, you have no chance of plying your trade in a mall. And the reality of the situation on the ground is that the poor and dispossessed get pushed onto marginal land which is yet to be developed, whilst the well-off sit in their secure tenements. And as architects and urban designers, we often come up with these sustainable solutions. So there might be some sort of green roofed building or a vertical urban farm or something as the solution, technical fix. But I'm going to argue in the next 2 or 3 days that whilst they have some place, the reality of the situation for most people living in cities is that that's a distant dream. And you see these kind of images all the time. This could be anywhere. This is probably a plan for a Chinese city or a Middle Eastern city. It doesn't really matter in a way. They're all the same. And you get these architectural visions showing people walking the street. There's no cars. Where are the cars? They don't seem to appear here. We've got a monorail which is shaded out. Why is it in the sky when there's plenty of space on the ground? Where are the local shops? How do you move from this building to that building? Which buildings are residential buildings, which buildings are office buildings? There's no clarity to that. And actually the reality of the situation once it actually gets built is something like this. This is Dubai. And again, these places are very, very difficult to fit to higher energy prices and to the need to not move around using high amounts of resources. They're also socially unsustainable, I'd argue, as well. China has to build, there's an estimate that China has to build 100 cities of more than 1 million people in the next 3 years to cope with this urbanization. And it's building them they're kind of almost like cookie cutter cities. They just basically say, here's an area, make it a city, and they zone it for cities. They build lots of towers. Those are the towers from Google Earth as they look like at the moment. And that is the block that you've just seen. It's in a wasteland. It's an entirely empty city other than that block. So they've built many, many tens of thousands of apartments. No one lives there. It's in the wrong place. No one wants to live there. So these are the kind of responses in urban design terms which don't work. And China has a great heritage in creating fantastic, decent urban forms, such as these traditional houses, which are being demolished in essence to build these high-rise forms of development. So urban design, the form of the city, massively important. Again, if you were working in this building here and you wanted to visit your friend who's working in this building, you'd have to cross this enormous roundabout at different levels. These aren't human cities. These aren't places that we all want to live and work in the long term. The second key challenge is urban sprawl. A lot of people mentioned that already. It's been going on in the States for a long, long time, and it's been shown to have big impact on health. People drive everywhere. They become obese, unfortunately, and they're very difficult to retrofit. It's very difficult to put shops and other local services into these places because there's simply not enough people to support them. In fact, a study was done some time back now which looked at the density of different cities. So density is basically along this axis here. This is high density, that's low density, with the amount of transport energy that was used. And unsurprisingly, those North American cities that were low density, people had to drive everywhere. It's pretty obvious. Interestingly enough, the European cities tended to be in quite a good place. They're not too dense, so they're not overdeveloped, but they still have relatively low transport use. And the Asian cities tend to increase the density perhaps too much. This is a traditional sprawling retirement village in Florida, laid out so that as many plots as possible have access to the water. That's the cell. That's the cell for the people who live there. If I live here and I want to visit the local shop, maybe take my kids to the park, normal things people want to do every day, how do I do it? There's no bridges. I actually probably have to go all the way off the screen to actually come back down again. We're hardwiring in a form of lifestyle which we can't afford. And sprawl does that fantastically well. And what that means is the places aren't adaptable. So adaptability is a key requirement in creating a sustainable city. There are hundreds of malls in North America which are just dead because they haven't adapted to the changing economic and different climates. Sprawl isn't just a first world issue. This is Mexico City. It is also an issue across the globe. Transport congestion, infrastructure, people mention this most, I think, out of the responses we got today, and that's interesting given I think Madrid's situation isn't actually that bad. There are a decent amount of metro lines. I don't know about the pollution, I've only been here for a day, but it doesn't feel too bad. Shanghai, however, does have some big problems, and they are spending an awful lot of money building roads. They've built this big road here, and then they've had to build a double-decker road because there's not enough space on that road. Private cars have increased 25 times in the last 15 years. 600% increase in traffic accidents over 10 years. Imagine every traffic accident, the economic and social cost of that accident. But yet, an important statistic, only 9% of people drive to work. In London, it's 40. If Shanghai became like London, it just wouldn't exist as a city. It just wouldn't operate economically. So transport infrastructure is an enormous issue, and you can't build your way out of this problem. The Americans have tried. They've spent billions of taxpayers' money building freeways, intersections, and they've got some of the biggest amount of congestion and longest commuting times in the world. If you've got a lot of money, you can build one of these. This is Tokyo's metro system. It's the biggest in the world. It serves 34 million people, and 80% of people use it to go to work. So that's fantastic. For a developing world city, that's pretty good. But a lot of people don't have that kind of money. In Latin American cities, there's lots of experiments happening with transportation. There are a number of cable car projects happening, which are they're relatively low cost. You can get to the barrios on the hillside pretty quickly. In some places they're working quite well. This is Curitiba, and it's been sort of copied in many other places, including Bogota, which is a bus rapid transit system where you set aside a piece of the road for buses, and they're very, very quick, and they're pretty low cost, and they've, in places like Curitiba, have really transformed the place at relatively reasonable costs. And this is Lavapiés, which I think some of the team are going to be talking about on Friday. And I was there yesterday, and the City Council have tried to make the place a positive place for walking and cycling. And you can do that, and that can have a big impact. Copenhagen is probably the best example in Europe of where they've transformed their public realm, the way the streets are designed, the space is designed to encourage walking. And you actually see a real shift from cars and other forms to walking and cycling. The poor environment, climate change, a massive issue, particularly because most big cities tend to be on rivers or at the coastlines. Flooding, as we've seen in New Orleans, is a real issue. Hurricanes, typhoons, all those sorts of things. Even more importantly, the UN estimates that 4 in 10 people who live in temporary homes are at direct flood risk. So they're disproportionately affected by this issue. Energy, infrastructure is a big issue in many, many parts of the world. We're building huge numbers of coal-fired power stations, as many people know. And some people here mention the fact that pollution then affects the city itself, and that has a direct impact. In lots of parts of, say, Britain and other developed countries, we've moved those energy production plants out of the city to rural areas, and therefore the impact's gone down. But I think there's a general sense that we need to make the city a place of production as well as consumption of energy, and to create a more balanced grid. And there are lots of ways. This is a microgrid project where you've got a relatively green approach to producing energy that's in the city that doesn't cause pollution. It's also more secure as well. Building technology, communications technologies are massive challenges. In how do you retrofit existing buildings? How do you make them work socially, environmentally, economically? In Britain, we've built 70% of the homes that will be there in 2050, and 90% of those don't meet good building regulations. They're very leaky. The heat is just lost from them. How do we deal with that massive, massive issue? There's a vision of something called a smart city, which we'll talk a bit more about later on in the course, which is about connecting all the different parts of the city up using technology and allowing that to make the whole place run more effectively and efficiently. And that's fine if you've got a huge amount of broadband. Different parts of the world, there's much, much less connectivity. Maybe they'll leapfrog our technology and put mobile connections in so that you actually get that level of connectivity happening. And this modern technology can absolutely transform the way we understand a city and how we move about it. This is an app that you can use to report fly tipping. You take a picture, you send it to somebody, and it gets sorted. So our relationship with each other, with other people in the city, and our relationship with the municipal authorities will be transformed by these technologies. We're already at the very beginning of this. Again, technology can be used to make places more interesting. This is an art project happening in Madrid. I don't know if anyone went to it, but essentially using technology to make the public space work better, make people come together, create cultural events. As I said, demographic change is a massive driver. Mexico City's increased its population by 50 times in the last 110 years. In London, our population is growing very slowly, and we can't cope with it. Another great example, 45 people an hour are either being born or arriving in Mumbai. In London, it's 1 an hour, and we can't provide enough healthcare, schools, housing, transportation for those people in a rich city like London. How Mumbai copes is a big challenge. Whilst there's a lot of growth, there's also a lot of decline. Particularly in Europe and North America, this map shows where cities are actually shrinking. As people move to other places, suburbanization happens, there's globalization of the job market. Even within one country, you can get a huge variety. So in the United States, the central Rust Belt and some of the northern industrial cities, these blue areas, are reducing significantly in their populations, whilst the areas in red, the west, the south, increasing their population significantly. The kind of archetypal example is that of Detroit. Detroit's population in 1900 was about 300,000 people. In 50 years, it went up by 6 times to almost 2 million. In the next 50 years, it halved again, back to 900,000. And in the boom years, the last 10 years, which in America have been ones of growth and prosperity, it's reduced its population by another 20%. The whole city is being hollowed out. Huge areas of land are being abandoned, essentially. People have started farming again in the city because there's just so much land, you might as well do something with it. And lots and lots of properties are just being abandoned. So whilst there's a picture of growth, there's a picture of decline. It's complicated. Within each city, one of the biggest challenges we face in the developed world is that we are aging as a population. And again, that reflects the population in cities as well. And we need to create cities which allow people to age in a positive way. In the UK, in common with many other parts of the world, we have standards for new homes, which mean they have to be adaptable to people's lives as they become less mobile. But I believe it's more than just the housing stock itself. It's about how we actually create a neighbourhood where people can stay and live in a mixed ways. We don't create those kind of retirement ghettos that we saw in Florida. The job market is becoming much more globalised. We've got a great bunch of people here from around the world. That's a demonstration of the fact that people are looking further afield. I spent 3 years working on a project in the West End of Newcastle in northeast England. This shows the Tyne River and this huge area of industry in the West End, which was one of the workshops of the world. Many ships, guns, steel, all sorts of things were produced here and exported, and they built these large amount of Victorian workers' housing to house the people. Over the last second half of the 20th century, many of those jobs moved abroad to places like South Korea. This is one of the shipyards in South Korea which builds most of those ships now, and left these places high and dry. And now you see most of those houses have actually been cleared, and we've created large areas of open land in our city. And our job is to think about how that area can become more sustainable, where you've got no local services, not enough people. How do you make those sort of places work? In fact, the council started selling houses to local people for 50 pence in the 1990s. That's about 60, 70 euro cents per house, on the basis that they would live there for 10 years, I think, and spend £5,000 investing in that property because those properties are worth so little. So again, a big issue here. And again, looking back at growth, Bangalore, India's tech city, there are $10,000 millionaires living in that city at the moment, which has absolutely changed the way the nature of that city works and created all these enormous business parks, such as this one, with these rather interesting buildings. The response in the developed world has actually, there's a kind of theory called the creative class theory, which Richard Florida, is a guy in the States, espouses. What he says is basically, in order for your city to be successful in a sort of post-industrial world, what you have to do is attract the creative class in. So make it a nice place to be, improve the quality of life, and these are the real wealth creators that will come into your city, and then there'll be a spin-off, trickle-down effect to the rest of the place. There are a lot of problems with this approach. It has some interesting points. In the UK, we've spent a lot of time doing what we call cultural regeneration. So we're using culture as a mechanism to attract these people into our cities. This was one of probably several tens of art centres that were built in each of the major towns and cities around the UK. It cost £55 million. It's probably going to have to close because there isn't enough money to run it. So a lot of these things were built as mechanisms to create a more sustainable place, but don't actually work in reality. And many people were upset by the fact they actually wanted more basic needs met rather than spending money on relatively well-off people already. Poverty and unmet basic needs are absolutely crucial. This is a slum in Nigeria, one of the biggest slums in the world. Some of these slums are bigger than Madrid region in terms of their population, absolutely enormous. And in some countries, I mean, if you look at sort of Central Africa, for example, most of the cities are slums. 80–90% of the cities are slums themselves. So this isn't just a marginal issue, this is a fundamental issue of poverty. And all these issues are interlinked. I'm sure you're covering this elsewhere in your courses, but if you have dirty water, poor infrastructure, which means dirty water, means you get ill because you drink the water, which means you can't work and you get stuck in an economic cycle of problems. If you don't own your land, you're vulnerable to being knocked down, quite fundamentally. You can't get a bank account, you can't get a job because you don't necessarily have a fixed abode. So all these issues are kind of interlinked, and we can talk about these if people are interested later on. And some of the approaches that have been taken, i.e. slum clearance, don't work either, because people just get displaced, often to much worse parts of the city, much more peripheral parts of the city. Segregation is an enormous issue in cities. This is a very famous image of Sao Paulo. I don't actually been there, but this shows quite how you get these gated communities, incredibly wealthy. These people have swimming pools on their balconies, they're so rich, right next to an informal settlement. This can't be a socially sustainable place where people can have that inequality of wealth right next door to each other. And it's the spatial distribution of deprivation and different wealth is really important. In London, we have most of our deprivation is focused in the east end of the city. It's traditional industrial heartland. But we also have other pockets of deprivation around the other sectors of the city as well. So it's relatively distributed. Johannesburg is perhaps the other extreme. Most of the deprivation is focused around the outskirts of the city. So not only these people living in informal settlements or they have deprivation, but they also have long journey times to get to work. They don't have access to local services. The government is a long way away. Those kind of things make a big difference. There's been a decline in public funding within cities. I won't go into the detail here in Spain because I don't know the detail, but I know it in England. This is a map showing a coloured map showing where most of the reduction in public spending has been so far since we've had a new government since 2010. And if you map, so the black and red areas are areas where the biggest reduction per capita, and you find if you map on the areas which are cities, there's a direct correlation. So cities are losing funding at a greater rate than rural areas are. And that's probably true elsewhere as well. People talked about local citizen involvement. I think that's really, really critical. Traditionally, in the 20th century, I'd say in broad terms, was characterised by the increased power of the state over cities and its populations. The state collected most of the taxes, they gave some of that money, went down to the region, and a little bit of that money went down to the department and the community itself. The community often wasn't very happy about that. And I think there's a real movement globally now to try and cut the ties from the centre and allow local cities, neighbourhoods and towns to actually become more self-sustaining and engage with their people more. For example, in Latin America in 1970, I think there were about 3,000 local authorities. Now there are like 16,000. So that's just a trend. In the UK, we have a new bill going through Parliament called the Localism Bill, and this is trying to do exactly that, go away from a command and control economy with the centre determining everything and give more power back to local people. There are issues with this. We have a word in English called NIMBY, which means not in my backyard. That's what it stands for. And most people oppose development in the UK. It's traditional approach. And so localism also means that you can't necessarily tell people that we're going to have new homes in an area because they may not want the new homes. And it's a big challenge. Localism also ignores the fact that some places need to work together. We did a piece of work for 5 towns in Yorkshire, and we said that if they work together, they're more likely to get economic development than if they worked individually, and more likely to get investment into public transport, for example. So there is a role still for strategic planning. And lastly, but not leastly, there's a widening role of different stakeholders in the city. There's a massive influx of the power of the private sector in our cities. Traditionally in the UK, the local government and government built towns, they built cities, they built whole neighbourhoods. And now the private sector is expected both to build them and to manage them. And if you've been to London recently, we're getting ready for Olympics later on this year. This is Stratford in the East End of London. That's a view back towards the city. This is a huge area of old railway land, which was essentially converted to a new part of the city. And they've built all the Olympic Stadium. I'm going to talk a bit more about that after the break. They've built an enormous shopping centre by Westfield, which is a big Australian developer. And this is meant to be the sort of town centre for East London, in essence. But it's a private space. If you go in there, it is controlled. Not everyone can move in. So it is, these aren't democratic spaces. But at the same time, I'd argue that technology is allowing people to interact in the way they never could do before. The fact that people can watch us on the web is an example. We can have commentary, live commentary going on. But it does enable local people to get involved in a different way. So I am going to talk about some responses to those challenges. If anyone's got any quick questions, yes?
Sorry, what do you mean with democratic areas or not controlled, like parks or social areas?
I suppose what I mean is that in a traditional public space, as long as you're not committing a crime, you can be there, in essence. So whether that be a street, a park, or whatever. If you're poor, you're rich, you're from whatever country or whatever background, you can go there. And that the public authority has a long-term interest in keeping that space working. And the public authority has broader goals than just simply making a profit, clearly. In a lot of the sort of malls or the controlled environments of gated communities, what happens is that all that responsibility moves to the private corporation. Often their main goal is to make a profit, and they don't have the responsibility of allowing anyone in. They can say, no, I don't want these people to come in here. And they don't have to be breaking a law. They can actually refuse entry. So it's an important trend in cities, is this privatization of space, in essence. It's a big debate that's happening around the world. Yes? Yes, I think you're right. I think it is a bigger problem in places like India or in South America. And I think I'm not sure the exact reasons. I'd hazard a guess that because in developed countries, the public authority had a long time to get established and to establish the ways of which working. It meant that, because urbanisation was a bit more controlled. The state had a greater role, whilst in places like Sao Paulo, I think it's a bit more extreme. In terms of the, I think it's incredible the fact you get these, that image that I showed there. I mean, the fact you get these differences in one area is mind-blowing, really, isn't it? So, shall I move on to some responses, and then we'll have more time for questions at 11:30 if I get through these. Is everything okay? Are we going the right pace? Is it too slow or too quick? Is everything okay? I'm going to talk about a range of responses right from the sort of region right down to the very local. I can't talk about all the responses because they simply would be here for months. But I will just pick out a few that I think might be of interest to you. From a planning perspective, in the UK government, basically set a whole region aside as its eco-region. And this is what they call the Thames Gateway, which was the area between East London, Stratford, which is where the Olympics are taking place, all the way out along the Thames estuary, including out to the North Sea. This is an area, a huge area of brownfield land, which brownfield means that it's been previously developed land, so an old industrial land, that they wanted to use to solve some of the housing problems and some of the lack of development that we have in the UK. It was also based on the fact that we built a high-speed rail link, finally, first one in the country. It took us a long, long time to do it, between St Pancras and Paris. And so this was meant to be the trigger for that change to happen. And essentially what the government did is they took power away from the local authorities and gave it to special bodies that were set up to deliver change happening in the area. They set up a bunch of principles for the eco-region. They wanted to enhance public transport, so they set up a whole bunch of projects, a lot of which haven't actually happened with buses and rail and other forms of public transport. They wanted to retrofit existing homes. There's a lot of existing neighbourhoods here. How do you make them greener? By retrofit, I mean putting insulation in, making the boilers more efficient, that kind of thing. Again, most of the land was going to be brownfield, which is seen to be more environmentally friendly. So brownfield is this previously developed land, often contaminated, so it's got chemicals in it from the industry that was there. But also, interestingly enough, brownfield land tends to be left alone for long periods of time, so often it's actually more interesting ecologically than greenfield land, which has lots of, can be quite managed. There's lots of energy and technical fixes, including things like district heating systems. These are meant to be very efficient systems, centralised systems that allow for people to access heat cheaply and very, very efficiently. Obviously, it's along a river, so they need to manage flood risk. They had a big grid of walking and cycling routes for the whole region. There's a green enterprise zone which has been established for businesses, which looks something like this. This is part of it, where the UK government wanted to encourage in businesses that were going to grow on the back of the need to be greener, in essence, cluster them all in one place. The kind of outcome of it is that they've given planning permission for about 16,000 homes and space for about 14,000 jobs. But I'd argue that it probably was, on balance, probably not a great success because many of the projects never got caught up by the big economic crisis and meant that things didn't actually get built. And I think they didn't really deal with the social issues at all. This enhancing community involvement never really got done. They are building, if you are in London soon, you can go visit. This is a new centre for sustainable cities that Siemens are building in the Royal Docks. Again, I've not been there, but it'd be interesting to see when it is built, finished this year, how good it is. But if you go to the Olympics, then it's just down the road from the Olympics. So that was an eco-region. Stepping down to one scale to a new city, there are lots of new cities. This is a global phenomenon. Lots of people are trying to build new cities from scratch. Abu Dhabi is building a new sustainable city in the desert called Masdar. It is designed by Norman Foster, and it's based on apparently traditional Arabic urban forms. So it's a low-rise city rather than those towers that I showed you before. It's basically, essentially, it's a test bed for lots of different technology. So the idea is you either arrive by light rail, this is the light rail system coming in here, or alternatively, you drive in on these big roads, you leave your car on the edge, and you use a personal taxi, in essence, electronic taxi that takes you to your place. I'm quite cynical about this, but we'll see if it works. They There are lots of solar farms and various other things around the edge as well. And here's another image showing all the different kind of approaches. There's a use of kind of passive energy to try and make sure the place doesn't overheat, because a lot of these glass cities have enormous loads of air conditioning on them. So the idea was to try and remove the air conditioning load. So Abu Dhabi started this in 2006. It's one of the richest places on earth. They've managed to build 6 buildings so far. That's the red area there. It's cost them €1 billion so far. It's quite a lot for 6 buildings. They're very nice buildings though. They're constructing these yellow areas at the moment. So this essentially, there's 2 big squares here, and they're building one of these squares. Now I think it's great that people experiment. I'm really up for this, but I'm also a bit unsure about some of the issues. So this is the central square they've created. This is a wind. I think it's some sort of wind chimney that basically draws cool air into the development. And this is what it looks like from the outside. And then in a way, this is kind of interesting. Again, in my professional life, I spent a lot of time trying to sort out these problems. They've moved the whole development up a story. So all the servicing and the access happens essentially on ground floor, but underground essence. And all the people move about above ground. And we've had an awful amount of experience in the UK of this just not working. And you get in these sort of pods, and you move around the city. Essentially, they're electronic. You put in where you want to go to, and 3 or 4 people can get in, like a taxi. Again, perhaps in a less controlled environment, such as the UK, this place would be wrecked very, very quickly, I'm afraid. Sad, but true. A perhaps much more interesting example is how you retrofit an existing city. Rather than trying to create a new one, we've got lots of cities already, let's try and do something with the ones we've got. Curitiba has been trying this for a long, long time. It's a massively growing city. They decided to put a proper plan in place, which involved fundamentally reorganising the public transit system. I mentioned this before, it's bus rapid transit, runs on dedicated lines, it's very high quality service. It's like the metro, you go in, you go through barriers, you go onto it. If you're very poor, you live in the suburbs, you can exchange your rubbish recycling for a ticket. So it encourages recycling, and it allows the poor people to get involved. And 30% less fuel per capita is used on fuel than in other Brazilian cities. 85% of people in the city use the system, so it's a very democratic system as well. It's not just for the rich or for the poor. And the use of buses has increased by 50 times since the system was put in place. So it's, I'd say, very successful. But it's not just a bus system. This shows one of the routes out of the city. And what they've done is they've zoned the kind of 2 blocks back, or 1 or 2 blocks back from that corridor to be higher density development. So they've said that because this is more accessible, we can allow for more people to live and work in the area. So essentially, I think that reinforces the idea that this bus rapid transit works quite well. And it's also allowed them to take some streets out of the city centre and create more pedestrianised environments, which can be a very positive thing. They've also increased the amount of green space in their city. In 1970, there was 1 square metre per capita of green space, which is tiny. Now there's 52 square metres of green space. So what happened, a lot of the areas that were prone to flooding, they moved people out of those areas and created parks there, which is a sensible thing to do, and also increased the amount of parks that there are in the city itself. People, I don't know if any people who've been to Curitiba, but people say it's a nice place to go to. Yes?
Could you tell me about the maintenance costs? Does it take more money to maintain a green space rather than, I don't know, a sidewalk?
The answer is it depends on the nature of the green space. If the green space is sort of semi-wilderness, almost like this, then the cost is very, very low. If it's very, very formal green space, like the Madrid-Rio type view, that would be higher, obviously. It does vary. It does vary considerably. What we found, just an interesting point in the UK, is that we've traditionally got lots of parks in our cities, which is great, and they just mow them every 3 or 4 weeks. And what they found is that actually that's more expensive than leaving some of them to have wildflowers in them, which creates more environmental diversity. So sometimes it's better to spend less money and maintain them less, actually, because you get better diversity. Yes?
I just want to add that in the case of Curitiba, the green areas was same wild with a lot of some animals of the natural biodiversity, and these parks attract a lot of tourism, and this tourism helps to with the economy of the city and help to the maintenance.
That's a very good point.
Curitiba is called the London of Brazil because it's very green and very plant.
Well, that's very kind for London, I think. Any other points? Do ask some questions. So moving down from the whole city retrofit, that's what I call retrofitting, the idea of how to sort the city out, the existing city. Lots of places have tried to create new districts within cities. This is one of the most famous ones. It's Hammarby just outside Stockholm. It was originally planned for the 2004 Olympic Games, which they lost. But being Swedish and very efficient and effective, they got on with actually building it anyway. It's old industrial bit of land just to the south of the city, and I think it works very, very well indeed. It was trying to do lots of different things. Sorry, getting the other way. It was based again on a public transport spine through the area. In this case, it was a tram route which linked to the metro. And again, if you look along each of these routes, they also have all the shops here. So you can get off the tram and use the shops very easily. They used a whole range of different technologies to try and make the place greener. And some of them work better than others. They had to do solar cells to convert solar energy. They've got carpools to reduce the private motor travel. That can work very well, and we can talk about that a bit more if people are interested. Safe footways and bikeways. They've got this system where all the waste is actually sucked from your apartment into a central recycling centre, in essence. And apparently it works very well. Again, whether it will work well in all societies, I question, but it seems to work in Sweden. There's a whole range of other points that they make. They've also got, heat exchanger. I don't know the details of it. In essence, I think they use it for they use water treatment. They use some of the energy from the water treatment to either heat or cool the buildings. There's I can see more material if you're interested. There's a whole bunch of other material on it. They've got low flushing toilets. They've got combustible waste. So, for example, they burn some of their waste to create heating. The rainwater is treated and kept, and so the flood risk is actually reduced. They've actually got this system here, which essentially they try to make a closed system for environmental components. So, for example, human waste, when it's produced, is used on local farms to produce biofuels. Those biofuels are then burnt in the local district heating system, which then produce heat for the homes and also for the leisure centre and other things, and also electricity. So you kind of have a closed loop there of waste moving through the system. And there are other components to that system as well. And it works pretty well. I'm going to move to a very different place now. So is anyone have any questions about Hammarby? Yeah. The criticism, I suppose, of Hammarby is that I don't know the honest answer of how many homes. I think it's in the region of about 10,000 homes, so it's probably 20 to 30,000 people, that kind of thing.
I can imagine that this comes from the people as well, because if you just impose such a city on people who might not know about it, who didn't develop it, then they won't value it like this.
Exactly.
Work with it, because people have to work with that.
It's a really good point, particularly where you're working with an existing neighbourhood, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But yes, where you've got a brand new neighbourhood, you have the dilemma of who do I consult with, who do I work with? I've got this area, it's empty. Who are the people who are going to move there? I don't know who they are. So how do I actually design and work with them to make the place work? Hammarby is, I suppose, the one criticism of it is it's a bit of a middle class enclave of people. It's relatively well off. Because its environmental credentials are so good, it attracts certain kinds of people. And so perhaps it is not necessarily representative. I think when we're talking about all these examples, we have to think about, are they scalable? Can they be repeated elsewhere or not? The Masdar example, I argue, is not scalable. We can't. Most parts of the world, they can't just go around building new cities for billions and billions of euros. They have to retrofit. So whilst there are interesting experiments, I think we need to always question, how can we apply this elsewhere? This, I think, is a example where we can apply an example elsewhere. Kailicha is one of the largest townships in Cape Town, about 500,000 people. It was built in the late part of the apartheid regime in South Africa, essentially as a dormitory settlement for black South Africans who would live there. They would then come into the city to work and then go back again. So there was almost no facilities built there. It was simply just, here's a bunch of houses. And obviously, even with the new regime, they've got these settlements, they've got to do something with them. What's interesting about Kailicha also is that only 7% of people are above 50. It's an incredibly young place. Has some of the opposite problems that we have in the UK. And that's a sort of typical view of the kind of place it is. It's sort of low rise, lots and lots of different homes have been built, mainly by the people who live in them. Lots of spaces between buildings that no one really knows who owns them. And this has led to a lot of problems with crime. Crime is probably the single biggest issue, social sustainability issue, if you want to call it that, in Kailicha. And so one of the responses by the government was to institute a program of trying to tackle this through urban design. First of all, they mapped all the places in the city, in the area that had high areas of crime. That's a school, for example, and if you look at the next slide, that's the same school there. So the pink areas in this plan here show where in the city most of these areas of crime are. And what they then did is they said, in those areas we're going to do something very simple. We're going to create well-lit, well-overlooked walking, cycling routes. And every 500 meters or so, we're going to have a new building that's going to have, we call it an active box. It's going to be open 24 hours a day. It's going to have some employment uses in it. It might have some people living in it. It might have a community use. So that if you're walking along here, you can see the next one the whole time. And the reason why I call this urban acupuncture is because it's just doing something very small in a way on a grand scale, but it has had an enormous impact on crime rates in the area and sense of safety. This is a picture of these routes, lighting, school kids moving to school on those routes. This is an example of the active boxes, which are just simple buildings that people put up in order to support the uses. And then they have put lots of play areas. This is an immensely young population, and a lot of these kids couldn't go out after dark. Yes?
Doesn't that just move the problem to another region?
Well, in this case, it probably doesn't, because you haven't actually moved anybody. You've simply just said, here's some existing routes and we're going to really improve them, and we're going to just focus all the movement on one. Beforehand, sorry, it's probably quite hard to see, but in essence, people could move very informally through this area. There were no secure places at all, so all the people were dispersed. What we're doing, and what they've tried to do, is focus all the people onto a few number of routes, which means it feels much safer. I agree with you. I think if the alternative approach would be to actually take out large amounts of homes to build these routes, in which case you might displace some of those people. So this idea of urban acupuncture we're going to return to in the third day of our working together. The idea of what is the smallest thing you can do to make the biggest impact. I think it's a real theme for our austere times that we're living in at the moment. This is another example from Latin America. This is from a city in Chile, which has grown again massively. This is the central business district in and around here, and in and around the city centre, lots of informal settlements grew up over the last few decades. One particular inner suburb, should we say, was occupied illegally for 30 years by 100 families or so. They built their homes here, but the Chilean government wanted to offer them new homes far away on the outskirts of the city, but they would be brand new. But they didn't want to move. Their jobs, their lives, the community was there. And so the challenge for the architects, which is a fantastic architecture company called Elemental, who are based out in Chile, and done a lot of work in Latin America on this kind of approach, looked at how could this area work given they didn't own the land. So the fundamental question is that the Chilean government will give you $7,500 as a subsidy for every new home. That was fixed. The challenge for the community was, how do we buy land, infrastructure, for those buildings, so the sewers, the electric supplies, the streets, and how do we actually do the building for $7,500. Now, if you obviously go and buy land elsewhere, which is very, very cheap, but land in this part of the city, because it's quite central, it's quite expensive. So once you've paid for your land infrastructure, you're only left with enough money to build 30 square metres of home. Now, 30 square metres is about half a small home, roughly speaking. A sort of traditional family house is about 100 square metres or so. So what the architects did...
That subsidy was for each person?
For each house, for each home, each household. So what they did is they worked, the architects worked with the local community to come up with the idea of, rather than moving them, if they could only build half a house, which half should they build? That was the question. So which half was it that the architects could get built, and then the people, over time, when they had a bit more money and they saved up, they could build the other half. And that was the approach they took there. And in essence, this is the actual design of the homes themselves. What they offered the people is a shell, so it's not a finished home. You have a ground floor apartment, an upper floor apartment, in order to fit 100 homes back onto that same site. And you have all these spaces which allow you to fill them in over time. And they've repeated this approach in many, many places in Latin America. And it's been, I'd say it's just been very successful, because in essence, the alternative, because land prices in central areas are so high, is actually that they become peripheral communities. What happens is, this is what it looks like on day one when no one lives there. And over time, you see that people have actually started to fill in these spaces underneath the homes themselves. They've invested in the place. This model of co-investment, the idea that it's not about the government or local authority or big business just doing it to a community, just making a community more sustainable. It's about everyone investing in that place, I think is going to be a big theme again in our third day we'll talk about. Again, showing the previous situation, lots of kind of informal buildings, and the situation afterwards, where they now have title. They actually own those buildings, they own the property, so they can't be moved off. The kind of situation at the end of the build, you get something like this. Went back a couple of years later, and people have done this to it. We don't always know as professionals what's right for people. The architects ask people, do they want a bath, or do you want a hot water boiler to heat up water? And if you ask me, I'll more certainly want a boiler, because I want hot water, and we can find another way to have a shower or something else. But here they actually wanted a bath, because the running costs for a boiler, the gas costs, they couldn't actually provide themselves. So again, when we're talking, thinking, working with communities, you have to have an open mind about what actually works. I'm going to take some questions now, and a 5-minute break, or so a 10-minute break for people to go to the loo and things. I've got a few more case studies that I can go through afterwards. So maybe 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll come back and aim to finish in the next sort of half an hour after that. Is that okay? Yes?
I have a concern, and I have seen from your presentation the key challenges is perhaps a mix of symptoms, problems, and root causes. And the solutions you are providing...
Sorry.
I think the key challenges you presented previously are a mix, perhaps, of symptoms, problems, and root causes.
Yes.
And what I find lacking a little bit is a more systematic approach, because I think what you are showing is a set of very complex, multifunctional, multi-everything issues that are very difficult to approach from just one point of view.
Sure.
So, for example, I think the technological perspective is one, the economic perspective is another, the social perspective is another one, and the economic perspective is finally another one. So, what you have shown are some solutions which can be very effective from one or 2 or 3 of those perspectives, but that might not work in different environments in which the situation can be very different. So I don't think it's only a question of scale, scalability, but different response to different set of issues.
Yes.
So what do you think, or are you going to deal with this sort of multi-perspective, systematic issues in the next sessions?
I hope so, yes. It's an excellent question, because I agree, in a way, what I was trying to do this morning was just give you a flavour of some of the issues and a flavour of some of the responses. In 12 hours, one cannot hope to cover the topic in anything more than a very, very high level. On the third session, we're going to be talking about why we've set up this organisation called Smart Urbanism, and why we think it's a way of thinking about the problems that, of the multidisciplinary issues that we've raised today. So I appreciate, yes, I've not presented you with a grand theory of how to respond to the problems. I don't think there is a grand theory. I think there is a process and an approach which can be helpful. And in terms of your other point, yes, the answer, every specific neighbourhood, town, city, region has its own requirements for a defined response. One cookie cutter approach cannot work here, and that's why you can't import Curitiba and say, I want to put Curitiba into, well, I think in Curitiba they tried to make, Bogota tried to copy Curitiba. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't work. In London we're trying to copy Stockholm to make those eco districts. It probably won't work in different ways because of the different social, cultural, economic environment. So, in terms of your 2 points, yes, I will hopefully bring a slightly more formulated response by the third day. And secondly, I think it is a nuanced approach. This is a very, very complex area. It depends on the people and the place involved. And that's what's fascinating about it, because every place is different.
Because many cities have different multidisciplinary issues and different symptoms. But in your experience, what has been the trend that the city urban planners are being given the priorities when come up with developing policies? Because we have been talking about pollution, congestion issues a lot here. But do you think that there's some points and all the city planners are more focused these days? And about the smart grids, which countries are investing more in the developing the smart grids, or this technology of how to combine waste management and energy efficiency and pollution management?
Thank you. In terms of planning, planning is actually meant to be a science, in the sense that it's meant to be an evidence-based approach. Every decision you make, every plan, every policy you have in that plan has got to have an evidence base for it. And I think what that's also meant is that it's a very problematic process. In terms of the priorities, they'd vary. Clearly, if you're going to hand over a lot of the development of your city to the private sector, the economic component of planning becomes one of the most important ones. And so that though, planners, most people who go into planning want to make the world a better place. They're not there to make it any more difficult. They're idealists. So there are many approaches which are more positive than that. But I'd say the economic perspective is perhaps the most powerful, along with this idea that you can prove everything. You can show what the population will be like in 10 years and start building a school now ready for that 10-year process. Well, we've shown that you can't predict the future. We all know that. In terms of smart grids, perhaps the most famous example that I haven't shown any slides of is one in South Korea called Songdo, which essentially is an industrial park, in essence. It's probably the biggest private development of its kind in the world. And there they've basically put fibre optic cable into pretty much everything. Every building, every street, every lamppost, everything has got, is connected. And they're testing to see whether that actually makes it a place people want to live. Okay, it's great, it's all connected up, but that's the idea. I think there will be a. I think the Internet of Things, as it were, will mean that cities become much more interactive. The fabric of the city becomes much more interactive, and I suspect that we will leapfrog fixed broadband very, very quickly and move to mobile kind of receptors and things.